What if the most dangerous spy in the room never chose to become one? Not recruited at gunpoint, not blackmailed into a corner, not a zealot with an ideology burning through them. Just a man who said yes to a dinner invitation. A man who wanted to feel, for once, like someone important had noticed him. That's where this story begins, not in a safe house, not in a classified briefing. At a conference table in Geneva, with a glass of mineral water and a business card no one ever thought to question. His name is Daniel. He was 39 years old when the targeting began. He didn't know he was being targeted. That's the first thing you need to understand about how this works. By the time a person realizes the approach is happening, the approach is already over. Daniel was a chemist, not a weapons scientist, not a defense contractor. An industrial chemist at a mid-tier research institute in a mid-tier Eastern European city, doing work that mattered to his field and to almost no one outside it. He had 2 children, a wife who taught secondary school, a salary that had stayed flat for 6 years while his expertise had quietly become, in certain intelligence circles, extremely valuable. He was not a spy. He was a man with knowledge and a gap between what he had and what he felt he deserved. That gap is not a flaw, it's human. Most people carry it. Intelligence services study it the way engineers study stress fractures, not because the fracture is a moral failing, but because it tells you exactly where pressure should be applied. Daniel's gap was financial, but it was also something harder to name. He had spent 15 years building expertise that his own country's institutions undervalued. He watched colleagues with lesser records receive better funding, better travel, better recognition. He told himself it was politics. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things. In Geneva, someone was listening. Her name was Anna. She was Hungarian. She wore a conference lanyard for a West German chemical consultancy, and she knew enough about industrial processing to hold a real conversation. She was warm without being aggressive. She asked questions that made Daniel feel that his answers were interesting. She was a spotter, not a Mossad officer, not someone who would ever be connected to the operation in any official record. Her job was not to recruit Daniel. Her job was to find out if Daniel was worth recruiting. Over 2 days and 3 conversations, she learned what she needed to know. By the time Daniel flew home, Anna had already filed her assessment. The word she used, according to accounts of similar operations documented in intelligence literature, would have been something close to suitable. Daniel thought he'd made a business contact. Here is the first thing about this operation that you need to hold in your mind. Anna did not approach Daniel because Mossad had identified him in advance. Daniel appeared on the radar because of a pattern, a category of professional, and a category of institution, with a category of access. He was not special yet, he was a profile that matched. The approach came before the certainty. The cultivation would create the certainty. That sequence matters, because it means that at the moment Daniel first shook Anna's hand, there was no operation. There was only a question. The question was, will he? 6 months passed. Daniel received an email from a man named Reinhardt, referencing Anna as the mutual connection. Reinhardt was based in Frankfurt. He ran a consultancy that worked with Eastern European research institutions on technology transfer. He was interested in Daniel's work specifically. He had read 2 of Daniel's published papers. He cited them by title in the email. Daniel read the email 3 times. He told his wife a German firm had reached out. She asked if it was legitimate. He said he thought so. She said that was good. Then she asked what was for dinner. He didn't tell her that his hands had been slightly unsteady while he typed his reply. The first meeting with Reinhardt was in Vienna, a restaurant near the Ringstrasse. Mid-range, not ostentatious. Reinhardt was in his mid-50s, unhurried, with the easy confidence of someone who genuinely didn't need anything from anyone. That quality, the performance of not needing, is a specific skill. It is taught. It creates a particular dynamic in the person sitting across from it. It makes them want to offer something. Reinhardt asked Daniel almost nothing sensitive. They talked about the industry, about the gap between Eastern European research quality and Western funding access, about the frustration of doing good work in institutions that didn't know what to do with it. At one point, Reinhardt looked at Daniel and said, "The problem isn't that people like you lack value. The problem is that the systems around you weren't built to recognize it." Daniel said nothing. He picked up his wine glass. That sentence was not an accident. No contract was discussed that evening, no money, no requests. Reinhardt paid the bill. They shook hands outside. Reinhardt said he'd be in touch about a potential consulting arrangement. Nothing formal yet, just a conversation. Daniel said that sounded fine. On the train back to his hotel, Daniel thought about the evening. He thought about how long it had been since a professional conversation had felt like that, like he was being seen clearly, rather than managed or tolerated. He did not think about why a West German consultancy would fly a senior partner to Vienna to have dinner with a mid-level chemist from Eastern Europe. He did not ask himself that question. That is the second thing you need to hold in your mind. The question was there. The logic was there. A reasonable audit of the evening would have raised it immediately, but the feeling of being valued, specifically, precisely valued, is a very effective interference with reasonable audits. Reinhardt had been trained to produce that feeling. Not to fake warmth, to deploy it, at the right moment, in the right quantity, without tipping into flattery, which creates suspicion, just enough to leave a residue. Daniel carried that residue home. His wife noticed something had shifted. Not dramatically. She wouldn't have been able to name it. But that night, when he talked about the meeting, there was something in his voice, an energy she hadn't heard in a while. Oh, she was glad. She thought, maybe this is the thing that finally gives him what he needs. She didn't know what she was glad about. That's the cost seated here, not yet visible, not yet named. Just a woman filing something away. A small warmth toward a development she does not understand and has not been given the information to evaluate. 3 more meetings followed over the next year, each one in a different city, each one ending with a small request, each one slightly more specific than the last. Daniel said yes to each of them. He told himself it was consulting work. He told himself the requests were commercial, not sensitive. He told himself that anyone would do the same. But at the 3rd meeting, in a hotel bar in Prague, Reinhardt asked him something that made him pause for just a moment. Just one moment. And in that moment he almost said, "What exactly is this for?" He didn't. He answered the question. What did Reinhardt do with that pause? He noticed it, filed it, said nothing. Because a handler who acknowledges a threshold makes it real. A handler who doesn't acknowledge it lets the asset pretend the threshold wasn't crossed. Daniel needed to pretend. Reinhardt let him. Here is the question this story is going to ask, and not answer yet. At what point did Daniel become an asset rather than a man who had simply made a series of choices that hadn't been examined closely enough? Was it the first meeting? The 3rd request? The moment he stopped asking what the information was for? Or was it earlier, at a conference in Geneva, before anyone had said a word, when a woman with a lanyard and a warm smile decided that he looked like someone with a gap that could be used? He doesn't know the answer. He may never have known it. That's what this operation was built on. Daniel told himself the arrangement was temporary. That is the first thing most assets tell themselves. Not that what they're doing is harmless. Not even that it's justified, simply that it won't last long. That there is an exit somewhere ahead, unmarked but real, and that they will recognize it when it arrives. The exit never arrives, because the people managing the arrangement are specifically trained to ensure it never comes into view. By the 14th month, the requests had changed in character. Not dramatically, that is the point. Dramatic changes trigger alarm. What Reinhardt had done, what the operation had done, was move the threshold so gradually that Daniel had no single moment he could point to and say, that is when it became something different. The early requests had been about published research. Conference attendee lists, procurement timelines for equipment that appeared in public university budgets. The newer requests were about people, which researchers at Daniel's Institute had expertise in specific chemical processes, which ones traveled internationally, which ones had expressed frustration with funding or institutional politics, which ones had families abroad. Daniel told himself he was providing professional assessments, background information, the kind of thing a headhunter might ask. He told himself that because he needed to. There is a mechanism in human psychology that intelligence services rely on more than any technical tool. It is not blackmail, it is not coercion. It is the simple, devastating fact that once a person has committed a series of acts they cannot publicly acknowledge, the cost of stopping becomes higher than the cost of continuing. Stopping means confronting what the previous acts were. Continuing means they remain, for one more day, something that can still be explained away. Daniel was in that mechanism now. He hadn't been pushed into it. He had walked into it the way a person walks into a room, and then realizes quietly that the door behind them has no handle on the inside. His wife's name was Marta. She was not a suspicious person by nature. She was practical, warm, and had built her sense of their marriage on a foundation of knowing her husband, his moods, his rhythms, his particular brand of professional frustration. She had known him for 16 years, which is why, in the 15th month of the operation, she said something over breakfast that stopped him cold. She said, "You're different when you come back from these trips." He asked what she meant. She said, "Not bad different, just elsewhere, like part of you stayed." He said it was the work, the pressure of the consulting schedule on top of his institute responsibilities. She looked at him for a moment in the way that she sometimes did, not accusatory, just precise, and then she said okay and refilled her coffee. He sat with that okay for the rest of the day. That evening, he drafted a message to Reinhardt. He didn't send it. He wrote that he needed to step back from the arrangement, that the workload was becoming difficult to manage, that he was grateful for the opportunity but felt the timing wasn't right to continue. He read it back. It was careful, plausible, the kind of thing a person says when they want to exit something without naming what the something is. He deleted it, not because he was afraid of Reinhardt's response, because he understood, at the moment he read it back, that sending it would require him to explain to himself why he was sending it, and that explanation would require him to name what the arrangement actually was. He wasn't ready to name it. He went to bed. 3 weeks later, in a hotel in Budapest, he raised it anyway. Not with a letter. Face to face. He told Reinhardt that he was finding the arrangement difficult, that some of the recent requests had felt, and here he used a word that was careful and insufficient, uncomfortable. Reinhardt listened without interrupting. Then he said something that Daniel had not expected. He said, "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." That sentence should have been a relief. It wasn't, because relief was not what Daniel felt. What he felt was a sudden, acute awareness that Reinhardt's response had arrived too quickly, too calmly, and in exactly the right register to neutralize the conversation without actually responding to it. Reinhardt said the pace could slow, that the recent requests had been more intensive than usual due to circumstances he couldn't fully detail, that Daniel's comfort with the arrangement was important to the consultancy. The word he used was essential. He said they could take a step back. Reassess, no pressure. He said this warmly, reasonably, with the expression of a senior colleague who has genuine regard for the person across from him. Daniel nodded. The conversation moved on. On the train home, Daniel turned the word essential over in his mind. Not essential like you are valued. Essential like you cannot be lost. There is a difference. He felt it without being able to articulate it. It sat in him like something that hadn't fully resolved. What Daniel did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the operation around him was not at that moment in a period of reassessment. It was in a period of acceleration. 3 months earlier, A separate intelligence stream had indicated that Daniel's institute was adjacent to a procurement network that a state-level program had been using to source specific precursor materials. Not through Daniel, not with his knowledge, but the institute was a node, and Daniel was inside the institute. In Tel Aviv, his file had been elevated. The requests for people, for information about his colleagues, were not a headhunter's questions. They were a mapping exercise. Mossad was trying to determine whether another asset could be developed inside the same institution through Daniel's referrals. Daniel was no longer just a source. He was being used as an access point into a second recruitment operation he had no idea existed. Reinhardt knew this. He had received the updated operational directive. He had understood what the acceleration meant for Daniel's exposure. He had sat across from Daniel in Budapest, heard Daniel say the word uncomfortable, and chosen to de-escalate the immediate conversation rather than disclose any of this. That choice was professional. It was also a betrayal of a specific and quiet kind, not malicious. Simply an instance of the fundamental structure of the relationship. Daniel's welfare and Daniel's utility were not the same thing, and when they diverged, utility would be what was protected. Reinhardt liked Daniel. That was probably true. It changed nothing. 6 weeks after Budapest, Daniel received a new request. It was framed, as always, in commercial language, but it asked about a specific colleague, a woman named Irina who worked in a department adjacent to Daniel's. It asked about her travel history, her family connections outside the country, whether she had ever expressed dissatisfaction with her funding situation. Daniel read the request twice. He recognized the shape of it. Because the questions being asked about Irina were the same shape as the questions Anna had been asking about him 4 years earlier in Geneva. He understood in that moment what the pattern was. Not the whole operation, not Mossad, not the geopolitical architecture behind the requests, just the pattern. He was being asked to do to someone else what had been done to him. He did not respond to the request for 11 days. That silence, 11 days where he neither complied nor refused, was the most honest thing he had done in 4 years. He didn't know what to do with the honesty. He couldn't tell Irina. He couldn't warn her without explaining why he was warning her. He couldn't explain why without accounting for everything that had brought him to the point of knowing. He couldn't go to his own government. The accounting there would be worse. He couldn't tell Marta. He was in a structure with no exit that didn't require walking back through every room. On the 12th day, he responded to the request. He provided a partial answer. Vague, less than he knew. He told himself he had protected Irina by giving them less than they wanted. He understood, even as he told himself this, that it was not true. A partial answer is still an answer. A partial targeting package is still a targeting package. He had not protected Irina. He had protected the version of himself that could live with what he'd done. In Tel Aviv, the partial response was noted. An analyst flagged it. The word used in the internal assessment was hesitant. A hesitant asset is not a blown asset, but a hesitant asset is an asset that requires management. The question the operation now had to answer was not whether Daniel was still useful. He was still useful. The question was whether the person running him fully understood why Daniel had hesitated, and whether the reason for that hesitation was a problem that could be managed or one that had already grown past the point of management. Nobody in Tel Aviv knew the answer yet. Neither did Daniel. The meeting in Bratislava was supposed to be routine. That word, routine, had become the container Daniel used for everything he didn't want to examine too closely. The meetings were routine. The requests were routine. The careful editing of himself that happened every time he crossed a border and became, for the duration of a train ride or a hotel check-in, someone slightly different from the man Marta made coffee for on Sunday mornings. All of it routine. Routine is what you call something when you need it to have no weight. Reinhardt had chosen a restaurant in the old town. Quiet, mid-afternoon, the kind of place that emptied out between lunch and dinner. Daniel arrived 8 minutes early, which he always did, and sat facing the door. which he had started doing without deciding to. He noticed he had started doing it. He ordered water and did not look at his phone. Reinhardt arrived exactly on time. He always arrived exactly on time. Daniel had once found that quality reassuring. Now it felt like something else, like the punctuality of a system rather than a person. The first 20 minutes were normal. Industry talk. A question about a conference Daniel had recently attended. A comment about funding shifts in Western European research institutions. Reinhardt was good at this. The maintenance of a surface so consistent that sitting inside it felt like being in a room with stable walls. Then Reinhardt placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. He did it the way you might place a bill, casually, without ceremony. He left his hand on it for a moment, then moved the hand away. He said, "There's a name on there. Someone your colleague Irina knows well. We'd like your read on him." Daniel looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. There was a pause that lasted, by his estimate, about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time in a quiet restaurant. Reinhardt filled none of it. Daniel picked up the paper. The name on it was a man he knew. Not well, an acquaintance from a conference 2 years earlier. A researcher from a different institution, different country. Someone who had no connection to Daniel's current work and no reason to be on a list that Daniel was being asked to evaluate. He set the paper down. He said, "I don't know him well enough to give you anything useful." Reinhardt said, "You know him better than we do." Daniel said, "I've spoken to him twice." Reinhardt said, "That's twice more than most." It was the kind of exchange that moved like a negotiation but wasn't one. Because in a real negotiation, both parties can walk away. Daniel had understood, somewhere in the previous 6 months, that the walk-away option had a cost attached to it that Reinhardt had never stated directly, but had never needed to. He said he would think about it. Reinhardt said that was fine. They ordered food, they ate. The conversation moved elsewhere. Daniel thought, "I handled that." He had not handled it, he had deferred it. Those are not the same thing, and some part of him knew the difference and chose not to say so. The false start came 4 days later. He had drafted, this time not a message to Reinhardt, but a message to a counterintelligence contact at a domestic security agency, a man he had met once at an institutional briefing, whose card he had kept in the back of a desk drawer for 2 years, without knowing why. The message was careful. It said almost nothing directly. It asked, in the language of a person who was curious rather than confessing, about the process for reporting contact with foreign commercial entities that had behaved in ways that felt, and here was the word again, uncomfortable. He read it back. He deleted it. Not because the message was incriminating, because sending it would begin a process he could not control. And the thing about processes you cannot control is that they do not stop at the point you intended them to stop. They go back. They go further back than you want them to go. They go back to Geneva. He closed the laptop. He went and stood in the kitchen for a while, not making anything. Marta came home and found him there. She asked if he was all right. He said he was tired. She looked at him with that precise look, not accusatory, just the look of a person reading something they have read many times and noticing a sentence that seems different today. She didn't say anything. She put her bag down and started making dinner, and the normality of that, the specific, ordinary, unremarkable normality of it, was almost unbearable. He thought, if I told her right now, in this kitchen, everything, what would happen? He knew what would happen. He had run the sequence in his mind before. The disbelief first, then the recalibration, then the accounting. 16 years of marriage running backward through a new filter. Every trip, every late return, every edited explanation. He could not do that to her. He told himself he could not do that to her. That was probably true. It was also useful. The near abort happened on a Tuesday. He had agreed to meet Reinhardt one more time, not in Bratislava, a different city, Warsaw, neutral ground, framed as a check-in. He had agreed because refusing the meeting entirely felt like a more visible action than attending it. He booked the train. He packed a bag. He told Marta it was institute business. He got as far as the platform. He stood on the platform with his bag and the train in front of him, and something happened that he could not fully name. Not panic, not resolve, just a sudden, very clear sense that getting on the train was a door, and that doors, once walked through, changed the geometry of what was behind them. He stood there for the full boarding window. The train left. He stood on the empty platform for a while. Then he took out his phone and sent Reinhardt a message saying he had missed the train due to a scheduling conflict at the institute, and could they reschedule. Reinhardt replied within minutes. Of course, no problem. Next week, perhaps. The ease of the response was its own information. He had expected, not consciously, but somewhere beneath the conscious level, that missing the meeting would produce a reaction. Some pressure. Some signal that the arrangement had expectations attached to it that couldn't simply be rescheduled away. The absence of that pressure felt like relief. It was not relief. What it was, though Daniel didn't understand this yet, was the operation managing him. A handler who reacts to a missed meeting with pressure confirms to the asset that the relationship has a coercive dimension. A handler who responds with easy accommodation confirms that the relationship is voluntary, collegial, safe. Reinhardt's reply was not indifference. It was technique. Daniel read it as freedom. He went home. He slept better than he had in weeks. The meeting happened the following Tuesday instead. He went, he got on the train, he arrived. He sat across from Reinhardt in a different city and had the same conversation in a different room, and at the end of it he had provided a partial assessment of the man whose name had been on the folded paper in Bratislava. He told himself he had kept it vague, told himself he had given them nothing actionable. Reinhardt thanked him, said the assessment was helpful, said the assessment was exactly what they needed. Daniel heard that sentence and understood, in the specific way that people understand things they cannot afford to fully understand, that exactly what they needed and nothing actionable could not both be true. One of them was wrong. He did not ask which one. He shook Reinhardt's hand. He walked out into a Warsaw afternoon that looked like every other afternoon, gray, ordinary, full of people moving through their lives without any of this in them. He found that he envied them. He found, more precisely, that he could remember being one of them, and that the memory had begun, without his permission, to feel like something that had happened to someone else. The investigation didn't start with Daniel. That is the thing about fallout in intelligence operations. It rarely begins where you expect it to. It begins at the edge, in the peripheral vision of a system that wasn't looking for you specifically, but was looking in your direction. The counterintelligence division of Daniel's country's domestic security service had been monitoring anomalous procurement patterns at 3 research institutions for the better part of a year. Daniel's institute was one of them. Not because anyone had flagged Daniel, because the institute itself had appeared, twice, in financial transfer records connected to a Liechtenstein-registered consultancy that had also appeared in an unrelated German federal investigation into technology transfer violations. The Liechtenstein firm was the same shell company that had been used to pay Daniel. Nobody had connected Daniel to it yet, but the file was open. The thread was there. And threads, once pulled by the right hand, do not stop at the point you hoped they would. The first consequence Daniel felt was not official. It was a conversation. A senior colleague at his institute, a man named Havel, 10 years older, careful and well-connected, in the way that certain Eastern European academics had learned to be careful and well-connected during the previous political era, stopped Daniel in a corridor one afternoon and said, without preamble, that he had been asked some questions. He said it the way people say things they want to have said without being heard saying them. Quietly, eyes on the middle distance. Daniel asked who had asked. Havel said, "People who ask questions." He walked away. Daniel stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he walked to his office and sat down and did not open anything on his desk. He sat with the information the way you sit with a medical result you were expecting but hoped wouldn't come. The system was moving, slowly, at its own pace, toward him. He contacted Reinhardt that evening. The message was brief. He said something had changed and they needed to speak. Reinhardt's reply came the next morning. It was calm, brief, and suggested a meeting in 2 weeks in Vienna. 2 weeks. Daniel read that and understood something he had perhaps always known but had never allowed to become fully conscious. The timeline of the operation and the timeline of his safety were not the same timeline. Reinhardt's 2 weeks was operationally reasonable. For Daniel, 2 weeks was 2 weeks of a domestic counterintelligence thread running closer to a shell company he was connected to. He replied that he needed sooner. Reinhardt said he would see what he could arrange. The "what I can arrange" was its own answer. It told Daniel, without stating it, that his urgency registered as a management problem rather than a shared emergency. He was not Reinhardt's partner in this. He had never been. The meeting happened 10 days later, not Vienna, a different city. Reinhardt arrived and was, as always, calm. He listened to what Daniel described, Havel's corridor comment, the questions, the procurement investigation he had pieced together from institutional rumors, and he nodded throughout in the manner of someone processing rather than reacting. Then he said, "We know about the investigation. It isn't directed at you." Daniel asked how he could be certain. Reinhardt said, "Because if it were directed at you, this meeting wouldn't be happening." That sentence was designed to reassure. It landed as something colder, because it confirmed explicitly what Daniel had understood implicitly, that Mossad's operational calculus about this meeting was based on their assessment of his exposure, not his. That the meeting was happening because it was still useful for it to happen. That if the calculation changed, if Daniel became a liability rather than an asset, the meetings would simply stop. There would be no warning, no exit protocol, no managed transition. The arrangement would end the way arrangements like this end, with silence, and with Daniel holding everything alone. He drove home and did not speak to Marta for most of the evening. She didn't ask why. She had stopped asking certain kinds of why approximately 8 months earlier. That silence between them, the specific practiced silence of two people who have learned which questions not to ask, was itself a consequence. One that had no name but had been building for years and was now structural. The researcher named in the Bratislava request, the man Daniel had provided a partial assessment of these, was approached by a commercial contact 6 months after that meeting. Daniel didn't know this. He wouldn't know it for years, and even then only partially, through a second-hand account from someone who had no reason to connect it to him. But the approach happened, and it followed the same architecture Daniels had followed, the same patience, the same calibrated warmth, the same careful escalation of small requests. The partial assessment Daniel had provided, the one he had told himself was vague, was harmless, was nothing actionable, had been enough. Exactly what they needed. Reinhardt had said that. Daniel had noted it and moved past it, but the sentence had been accurate. A partial profile, combined with what the operation already had from other sources, had been sufficient to determine that the researcher was a viable recruitment target. Daniel had not recruited him. Daniel had never met with him again. Daniel had, in his own accounting, provided almost nothing. In the operations accounting, Daniel had provided the piece that completed a picture. The Liechtenstein investigation did not reach Daniel directly. It reached the shell company. German federal authorities eventually connected the company to several technology transfer irregularities involving Eastern European research institutions. The investigation ran for 3 years. It resulted in 2 prosecutions, neither of which involved Daniel, neither of which publicly named his institution. But the investigation produced a secondary counterintelligence review inside Daniel's country's security services, a quiet internal audit of researchers who had had contact with Western commercial entities during the relevant period. Daniel's name appeared on a list, not as a suspect, as a person of potential interest. The distinction is real, it is also not permanent. The file existed. It would continue to exist. It could be reopened by any future investigation that produced a reason to reopen it. The thread was not cut. It was filed. Daniel didn't know his name was on the list. He would spend the next decade not knowing, and that not knowing would become its own kind of weight, the particular anxiety of a person who has done something they cannot account for, waiting for an accounting they cannot predict. He retired from the Institute 11 years after Geneva. The retirement was unremarkable. A small gathering, colleagues who had known him for decades, a speech from the department head that described him as thorough, dependable, and professionally committed. He stood in the room and listened to himself, described and felt, beneath the occasion's ordinary warmth, the particular loneliness of a person being accurately described in every dimension except the one that had shaped the last decade of their professional life. Marta knew something. Not the specifics, not the shape of it, but in the way that people who have lived alongside someone for 30 years develop a knowledge that operates below language. She knew that there was a room in him she had never been in. She had stopped trying to find the door. She had built her life around the room's existence without ever naming it. They were still married. That is not a small thing. It is also not the same thing as being known. What the operation cost Daniel was not freedom. He had never been imprisoned. It was not his career. That had continued unremarkably to its end. What it cost was the coherence of his own life story. The story a person tells themselves, about who they are, about the choices they've made and why, requires a continuous thread, a through line. Daniel's had a section in the middle that could not be integrated into the rest without pulling the whole thing apart. He had never found a way to integrate it. He had found a way to live beside it. That is what these operations actually produce at the individual level. Not heroes, not villains. People who made a series of ordinary human choices inside a structure specifically designed to make each individual choice feel manageable, and who arrived years later at a place they could not have predicted from any single decision along the way. The Mossad recruitment pipeline doesn't require extraordinary people. It requires ordinary ones. And ordinary people are, by definition, everywhere. If this kind of documentary work interests you, the mechanics of influence, identity, and the architecture of long-term deception, the sourcing for this script draws from open literature that is worth reading directly. Ronan Bergman's Rise and Kill First, Victor Ostrovsky's By Way of Deception, and Michael Ross's The Volunteer cover this territory with the granularity that a documentary can only approximate. The full picture is in the primary sources. If you found this useful, the next operation in this series goes further inside the cover identity architecture, and further inside what happens when it fails from the inside out.